Pythagorean identities. We have three of them, as you can see. I'm going to focus on this one, and then we'll come up with these two later on. Remember the song? It goes psi y cos x, tangent is y over x. So if I wanted to rewrite this, I would say that sine squared theta is the same thing as y squared theta, which anytime we have in the song, it's silent, psi y. That means it's over h squared, plus cosine squared, which would be x squared over h squared, psi y cos x, tangent is y over x. There's no tangent here, it's just a 1. I would have this equation, and I'm going to show you why this makes sense. Let's say we took this and we decided let's solve the equation for let's put h squared over here. So I multiply each side by h squared. Now if I did that over here, those would cancel or simplify out, and I'd be left with y squared plus x squared equals h squared, where this is the y value, this is the x value, and this is our hypotenuse. Now let's go look at a graph, and this I think will make a lot of sense. No matter what point we pick, let's say we pick any point over here. Let's take this one. What we could do is if I pick just any random point, as you saw, I just picked a random point, I just drew one. And if I drew this down here and this here, I create a right triangle. And in this right triangle, I have a y value. I have this x value here. Technically, this is a negative x, but just for the sake, I'm going to put an x. And this would be the hypotenuse, the h. Now, what have you learned in geometry that solves a right triangle with the side lengths? What's the relationship? It's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The Pythagorean Theorem. What's a squared and b squared represent? The side lengths, which in this case would be your x squared and your y squared. And I'm writing it in this order because it blends in over here. Would equal the hypotenuse squared, which in this case is h squared. You see how I get this formula from it? And again, if you divided h squared across, you would end up with sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So that's the relationship. That's the proof, if you will, of why these are true. It's because this comes from this original over here in green. Now, how do you get these two? Well, it's real simple. To get this formula, tangent squared, remember psi y cos x, tangent is y over x. It's the y over the x. If you divide this by cosine squared, you have psi y cos x. You're doing y squared divided by x squared, which gives you tangent. Now, if you divide this by cosine, you'd also have to divide everything else by cosine squared. Now, if I divide everything else, cosine squared divided by cosine squared is 1. 1 over cosine squared, according to the formula, the reciprocal identity. 1 over cosine squared, 1 over cosine is secant. So 1 over cosine squared would be secant squared. And so that's how you would get this formula. And to get this last one over here, what you would do is instead you would divide, instead of dividing by cosine, you would divide everything by sine. If you divide everything by sine squared, or rather, you would come up with this formula. So now let's practice this. So we come over here, it says if cotangent theta equals 2 and cosine is less than 0, find sine and cosine. Well, first, cotangent. What is that the reciprocal of? You go over here, cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent. So the song says psi y cos x, tangent is y over x. That means, since this is the reciprocal, if tangent is y over x, that means cotangent is x over y. Now this isn't written as a fraction, is it? So I'm just going to put it over 1. That'll make it easy. We'll say 2 equals our y, our x, because it's cotangent. This is our y. Now this says cosine is less than 0. Now psi y cos x. This cosine is the same thing as the relationship of x over h. Psi y cos x. H is silent. That means x over h is less than 0. Now what do we know here? We know that x is 2. So I want to substitute that 2 in right there. So I would say that 2 over h has got to be less than 0, meaning it's got to be negative. To make this negative, h has to be negative here. Or, as it's a hypotenuse, technically h is negative. Never negative. The x has to be negative. Well, how can this be negative if this is positive? Answer, these are both negative. So that's what I just determined here. Because h always is positive. H is always positive. It's the hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is always positive. The x can be negative because this would just mean going left. This would go left 2 units. Now, having said all that, let's find sine and cosine. Psi y, cos x, tangent is y over x. Sine is y over h. We've now determined y is -1, so this would equal -1 over h. Now, we haven't found h, have we? Let's find h. We use the Pythagorean Theorem. X squared plus y squared equals h squared. We know x is -2. We know y is -1. And this will help us solve for h. So -2 squared is +4. -2 times -2 is +4. -1 times -1 is +1. That equals 5. So h equals, well, typically we'd say plus or minus square root of 5, but hypotenuse is always positive. So it's the square root of 5 because h squared equals 5. H squared equals 5. So h equals square root of 5. I'll just circle this up so that we have it here. That's how we got our h. So we come over here. Sine is y over h, so it's -1 divided by square root of 5. And we do not leave a square root in the denominator. That's just bad math. So the way you get rid of it is you multiply top and bottom by square root that you have in the denominator. This is technically multiplying by 1 because the square root of 5 divided by square root of 5 is 1. But when I multiply this out, the square root of 5 times square root of 5 is square root of 25. And up here, I would have negative square root of 5. But the square root of 25, what is that? It's 5. So I would have negative square root of 5 over 5. This right here is sine theta. I'll put that over here. That's sine theta. That was because sine is y over h. So there's one answer. And now to find cosine theta. Cosine theta is psi y cos x. Cosine is x over h. The h is silent. So now we know what h is. And x, we found out over here, is -2. So it's -2 over the square root of 5. And we just learned how to get rid of a denominator with a square root. You multiply by the same square root, top and bottom. So I'm technically multiplying by 1, which this would give me -2 square root of 5. And I'm going to go ahead and skip over. We know this will be square root of 25, which equals 5. That is your cosine theta. That's how you solve problems of this nature.